On this vote, the yeas are 239 and the nays are 176. There are 2 present, and the joint resolution is passed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Nebraska rise? For what purpose does the gentleman from Nebraska rise?
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that when the House adjourns today, it adjourn to meet at 10 a.m. tomorrow, and further, when the House adjourns on that day, it adjourn to meet at noon on Monday, January 23rd, 2012 for morning hour and debate, and 2 p.m. for legislative business.
Without objection, so ordered. Yeah. The House will come to order. The House will be in order. Members are advised to take their conversations off the floor. For what purpose does the gentleman from Nebraska rise?
Unanimous consent to speak out of order to have my name removed from a bill.
The gentleman's recognized.
I ask unanimous consent to remove my name from the Stop Online Privacy Act 3261.
Without objection, so ordered. The chair will now entertain requests for 1-minute speeches. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arkansas rise? And the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The gentleman will suspend. The House will come to order. The House will be in order. Members are advised to take their conversations off the floor. The House will be in order. Gentleman from Arkansas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Permanent structural reforms are needed in Washington. The nation's debt is now greater than the value of the entire U.S. economy. Nonpartisan economists have noted that a debt-to-GDP ratio above 90% results in a reduction of economic growth. That means that the Obama administration's own economic model could be preventing the creation of nearly 1 million jobs. Over the last 2 weeks, I've talked to many of my constituents in Arkansas's 1st District, and nearly every person I spoke with told me that we must get our nation's debt under control. The federal government has a spending addiction that is paralyzing our economy. We cannot keep spending money that we simply don't have. We must start living within our means, and we must stop growing our nation's debt. Fundamental change must come to Washington to force this and future Congresses to live within our means. Both Republicans and Democrats are to blame for the poor fiscal health we find ourselves in, and whether the change is a balanced budget amendment or some other permanent binding measure, both parties must take the steps to prove that this Congress understands that our government cannot continue on its current path. Yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota rise?
To address the House and advise extend my remarks.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in regards to our most pressing threat to our national security, our staggering and ever-increasing national debt. The message for my constituents in Minnesota's 8th Congressional District is loud and clear. We cannot continue to saddle the soaring debt onto the backs of our children and our grandchildren. This is irresponsible and, quite frankly, unacceptable. Mr. Speaker, this is epidemic and a reason that I jumped into this fight. Our national debt will increase to over $23 trillion in the next 10 years. Currently, our debt is now over $15.2 trillion. 47% of that debt is foreign-owned. 30% is owned by China. In the past time to alter course, Mr. Speaker, this generation will be the first generation of this great nation to leave our children less off. And I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Time's expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania rise?
Unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and stand.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Less debt and more jobs, Mr. Speaker. This remains our priority as we begin the second session of the 112th Congress. Our national debt recently surpassed economic output, meaning the national debt is now greater than the value of the entire U.S. economy. Despite almost $1 trillion in stimulus spending, there's been 35 straight months of national unemployment averages greater than 8%. These are the facts, Mr. Speaker, yet some are calling for more deficit spending and tax increases, and that's just plain wrong. The best way to reduce our debt and deficit is to get America back to work. Over the last 12 months, this has been the focus of this chamber. The House has passed more than 30 jobs bills, most of which the Senate has refused to consider. Next week will mark 1,000 days since the Senate has passed the budget. Today, the House again has taken the steps to disapprove of further raising the debt ceiling. Failure to address even a budget will only serve to speed up our downward spiral. Mr. Speaker, there is no way around it. Without dealing with the debt, this country's long-term economic outlook will remain unclear. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota rise? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to honor the life of Reverend Bernard Reiser, who passed away late last year at the age of 87. Ordained in the Catholic Church in 1949, Father Reiser spent most of his adult life in the community of Coon Rapids, Minnesota, where he established Epiphany Catholic Church back in 1964. He helped grow Epiphany from a small 125-family parish to one of the largest parishes in the state with over 5,000 member families. And though he was well known in the community of Coon Rapids, Father Reiser's work extended far beyond its borders. Since 1996, he had traveled to Haiti, where he helped improve the lives of the less fortunate. And last year, he was honored for his international aid work by a local Twin Cities television station in our community. Though he will be missed, his memory does live on in the community, in the lives that he touched at Epiphany and in Haiti. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia rise?
Ask permission to address the House for 1 minute, revised in right.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's 3 things we need to do to create jobs in America. Number 1, we need to roll back job-killing regulations. You don't have to work for worker safety at the expense of the job. There is a balance. Government agencies need to work with the entrepreneur and the employer and the job creator, not against him or her. We can find the balance. Number 2, you need to drill your own oil. For us to suggest and believe that the people in the Middle East are more environmentally friendly, are more sensitive than we are, is ridiculous. We have got to get our head out of the Middle East sand and our drills and bring it back home to America. If gas fell $1 a gallon, it would be a huge economic boom to our country. And number 3, we need tax simplification. Ask any audience, how many of you fill out your own tax return? And then ask how many of you pay to fill out your own taxes, and inevitably you'll find a 80-20 split. It is ridiculous when 80% of the people in America have to pay an accountant or a lawyer to fill out their taxes. We need tax simplification. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina, gentlelady from North Carolina rise? Correct.
Permission to address the House for 1 minute, Mr. Speaker.
Apologies, and without objection, gentlewoman is recognized.
Apology accepted, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much. The headlines regularly remind us about the country's trying economic times. But back in the 5th District of North Carolina, there are stories of people coming together to help one another through difficult situations without the help of government. In Kernersville, North Carolina, for example, 2 local businesses have played a crucial role in ensuring that the communities less fortunate are fed. Over the holidays, the interior design company Designer's Attic and the construction firm Friddle & Company Incorporated paired up to bring thousands of meals to the needy. Designer's Attic decorated Friddle & Company's holiday house, which was open to the public for tours. Instead of a tour fee, the businesses requested that visitors pay in canned goods. Out Out of the shared endeavor, the businesses were able to donate enough food to the Second Harvest Food Bank for 17,000 meals. In a time of difficult economic news and consistent government overreach, it's a thrill to highlight this kind of success story. Congratulations to the good people at Designer's Attic and Friddle and Company Incorporated for giving back to the community in such a creative and effective manner. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair lays before the House the following personal requests.
Leaves of absence requested for Ms. Berkeley of Nevada on January 17th and January 18th, and Mr. Reyes of Texas for today.
Without objection, the requests are granted. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5, 2011, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gomert, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
You got me. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a privilege to be speaking on the floor here this evening. Here we've been talking for some time about the huge deficit spending that's going on. In fact, Republicans had promised to make massive cuts, and the old story that used to be told about the fellow Texan, Sam Rayburn, about a young freshman Democrat coming up and saying, talking about how difficult things were here in the House, and that, gee, as a Democrat, it's obvious the Republicans are our enemy. They're trying to stop us from doing what we need to, and boy, the media is not helping, and Speaker Rayburn stopped him reportedly and said, son, the Republicans are not your enemy. The media is not your enemy. At the other end of the hall, the Senate, now they're your enemy. Well, I thought that was a strange story when I heard that about Speaker Rayburn. But the longer I've been here, the more we see so many great bills that have come out of the House in the last year, have gone down the hall, and are languishing for a lack of action. And so when I read that our friend down the hall, Leader Reid, is lambasting Republicans for do-nothing status, it was remarkable to me that they could have so many House bills sitting down there waiting to do something and yet doing nothing with them. Now, we have been trying to get bills passed into law that would make substantial cuts. It's still, as our friend from East Texas, Bo Pilgrim, used to say, a mind-boggling thing to have seen this president come in 2009 with Speaker Pelosi in charge of the House and Leader Reid in charge of the Senate, and to know that we had been just vilified as majority Republicans in the House in 2006 for exceeding the amount of income coming in by $160 billion. Vilified. And yet when President Obama became the president and Leader Reid and Speaker Pelosi were in charge, we ran a deficit of 10 times that much in 1 year. Incredible. Now, one thing that should not have ever happened is to have our national security out on the table as a bargaining chip in the debt ceiling negotiation. But it was, and we were told that, gee, neither side is going to allow those kind of cuts to occur to our national security. And lo and behold, in being in Afghanistan, seeing the new year come in with our military men and women in some remote operating areas, went with Senator Jim Inhofe from Oklahoma and Joe Barton from Texas. Being in remote areas, it was amazing to hear some folks say we're already being told amounts that we're going to be cut because of the sequestration coming. Talking with some of our Texas National Guard folks, I've been told over the last couple of weeks we're already being told about monies that are being cut. These are people that are trying to protect and defend our country. I went to the deployment ceremony of a unit leaving from Lufkin, Texas, being deployed as guard, and they're hearing as they're being deployed about cuts to the amount of money they will have to protect them while they're protecting us. Absolutely outrageous. You know, as we talk about doing what's best for America, and as we hear from people around the world that think of the United States as the great Satan, one would think, especially if they study history, that the last thing we would want to do is to hurt our national security, yet that is where we're going. It seems also clear that those negotiating from the Republican side during the deficit debt ceiling bill made an assumption that turned out to be false, that Democrats in the Senate would never allow sequestration of $100, $200, $300 billion from Medicare. That was a bad assumption, because the same Democratic leadership in the Senate passed Obamacare, which brought about $500 billion in cuts to Medicare. So of course they were going to be willing to allow sequestration, because this time they would be able to blame Republicans for also being part of what caused the cuts. Cuts to Medicare and cuts to our national security. Not a good idea. Not a good idea. Well, National Review Online has an article in the last couple of days with some great information, and we have taken that information and put it in chart form from the article and double-checked, and apparently these are accurate numbers. These numbers, if anybody cares to contest them, actually come from President Obama's own Office of Management and Budget. It turns out that as this president and his administration has complained about not having money, not having the ability to make cuts, having to make draconian cuts to Medicare and to our national defense, his administration has been sitting on money, hundreds of billions of dollars of money that they haven't spent from 2010 and 2011. They're complaining about not being able to even cut $5 or $10 billion when it turns out they're sitting on hundreds of billions of dollars that have not been obligated, have not been spent from 2010 and 2011. So let's take a look at the money that this administration has not been willing to cut, even though it's unobligated, it's unspent, it's been appropriated, they have the ability to spend it or save it or spend it for something else, and yet this administration just can't seem to want to cut loose from this money, to reduce the deficit, to cut down on the money we'd borrow from China, to cut down on the deficit spending or the reduction in spending for the military, reduction in spending for Medicare. How about that? Turns out they're sitting on all this money. The Department of the Treasury, under the direction of Secretary Tim Geithner, hopefully he'll be okay getting his tax return in this year, he's sitting on $226 billion that was appropriated, and yet it is sitting there unobligated, unspent. Yet Timothy Geithner has told us, you know, there's just no money to do what he felt like needs to be done. He was out there this summer saying we've got to raise taxes because this poor gentleman was not going to be able to cut loose, as we find out, of the $226 billion he's got sitting in change. And that is not even including the $125 billion that he still has in TARP assets or money, and then it's estimated by some maybe about $50 billion in additional assets. So around $175 billion remaining from TARP, $226 billion sitting there appropriated. I guess that means we've already borrowed 42 cents of every dollar from the Chinese, so we're sitting on it. Then, Department of Defense, and since we've got $78 billion that the Defense Department has unobligated, has been appropriated but unspent, why couldn't we use some of that $78 billion to help eliminate some of the cuts that are being suggested, in fact being demanded, of defense? You got Department of Transportation with $45 billion in unobligated, unspent money from 2010 to 2011. You've got $40 billion from the Department of Health and Human Services sitting there, unobligated, unspent from 2010 and 2011. Department of Housing and Urban Development, $23.8 billion sitting there. Department of Education, $19 billion. And the thought comes, what if we did away with the Department of Education and all that money that comes pouring in to Washington every year, some of it borrowed, and that gets held here in Washington and gets funded to administrators and bureaucrats that have nothing to do with actually teaching anything? How about if we just turn that right around and send it right back to those states and said, we're taking our grimy fingers off of that money. We're not going to keep any of it because we think it is that important that it go for education. And how about if we, by doing that, therefore encourage every state, as I believe as Newt Gingrich suggested, to then let go so many of the administrators in each state capital that are not involved in any kind of teaching, just involved in dictation to local school boards. And of course, for every bureaucrat that we have to have right now in Washington, they have to have at least one in every state capital, and because they've got to carry out the assignments from Washington. And then for everyone in the state capital, you've got to have bureaucrats at each local school district to carry out those assignments. I was shocked to go online and see that one of the best school districts in East Texas was saying that they were proud to note that right at half of all their school district employees were actually teachers. So when I went to look at that a little further, you go back to before President Jimmy Carter created the Department of Education, that number was closer to 75% in Texas. Now it's around 50% in Texas. But before there was a federal Department of Education, about 75% of all Texas education employees were just wonderful school teachers, like my mother, like my sister, like my wife was. Now, that's getting teachers, that's getting people in the education system where they can do some good. So you got the Department of Education sitting on $19 billion. You go online and look up how many school districts there are in America and divide them into $19 billion, you'd have school districts that we're not having to fire teachers right now. That would do a world of good, but we got bureaucrats here in Washington think it's more important that they sit there with a slush fund, $19 billion, unobligated, unspent funds from 2010-2011. You got the Department of Labor. They've got $18 billion sitting there from 2010 and 2011, and we acknowledge it is important for them to sit on a slush fund because they have so many things they have to do, like they have to run to states like South Carolina and tell them you can't have a new Boeing plant in your state because we're trying to help unions in Washington, even though not one single union worker in Washington was going to lose their job or be adversely affected. We're going to rush in and be not a referee, we're going to be a player referee, and we're going to dictate like used to be done by Caesars, kings, czars, emperors, pharaohs. They thought they had the authority to come into South Carolina and play Pharaoh and say, nope, you're not going to have these jobs. Well, once the unions finally got satisfied, then isn't it amazing that the NLRB backed off some? I think we've seen the NLRB as something we could do away with, and one of our colleagues in our party here in the House has a bill that will do just that. I think it's time to do that. Department of Agriculture, $14 billion sitting unspent, unobligated from 2010-2011. Department of State, they don't have quite as much money sitting there as some of these other departments, but they still have $8.7 billion sitting unobligated, unspent from the last 2 years. Department of Homeland Security, $7.2 billion. Now, they may want to use some of that to go buy some more of these machines from our friend Secretary Chertoff. What a waste of money those were. Then you've got the Department of the Interior at $6.7 billion sitting unspent, unobligated in their coffers. Department of Energy. A Department of Energy that was set up by President Carter with the purpose of getting us off of dependence on foreign oil. And every year the Department of Energy has existed, one thing has been consistent, and we got to give them credit for this. One thing has been very consistent from the Department of Energy. Every year they've existed, we become more dependent on foreign oil. So, if you're in the private sector and you went all these years, 32 years, working on 33 years or so, with a department in your business that got further and further from its original goal, you'd probably cancel that department, get rid of it, disband it. Not here in government. Not only are they not doing what would help America by getting us off dependence on foreign oil, they are actually working in conjunction with the Department of Interior to make us more dependent on foreign oil and to limit the amount of production here in the United States. Just today, the President of the United States has had the incredible nerve to step up and say, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of Americans who I am going to deprive of the opportunity to have a good union job. And there are thousands and thousands and thousands of more of Americans who would be suppliers for those people who would be working on the Keystone Pipeline. Everything from private suppliers to people that work in steel plants that be providing the pipe, that be providing the materials that would be used, that would be building the heavy equipment that would be used. All of those thousands and thousands and thousands of ripple jobs that would be coming. This president today is saying, I am not going to allow you to have that kind of job. We're going to keep pushing, the president might as well have said, to make sure you can get unemployment for 99 weeks and we can keep you from reaching your God-given potential of actually producing, because there is a great deal of satisfaction for doing something productive, seeing the products of your hands. That's why, as my wife would tell you, I actually enjoy getting out in the backyard on weekends, kind of tough during the winter, but actually getting out there and doing things so that when I finish I can see I've done something productive. Because we come up here and we pass some good legislation in the House, it never becomes law. We pass things and encourage the President to get the Senate to help us pass off on things so people could become productive and they could get their own jobs and become productive, and they wouldn't need to become so dependent on the federal government. It gets pretty frustrating. But you've got Department of Energy sitting there, $5.6 billion, unobligated, unspent from the last 2 years. Department of Veteran Affairs, you would think that with all of the veterans who need assistance, who need help, who have problems, both psychologically, physically, that some of that $5.2 billion that's been sitting there for the last couple of years, it could have been used to help our veterans, you would think. Our veterans need help. President Bush, right before he left office, had asked a retired Army general to do an assessment of the VA and make recommendations. He had some good recommendations. Unfortunately, they've not been carried out by this administration. But one of the things he told me personally, privately, he said the problem with the Veterans Administration is they're supposed to be an assistance organization, and instead they think they're an adversarial organization. Should be assisting our veterans. And yet so often, every time a veteran comes through the door needing help, they look at them as if they're a thief coming in to steal something. Our veterans deserve better than that. There are some VA clinics, VA places, I know in Lufkin, I keep asking our veterans, even though I did 4 years in the Army, I'm not entitled to this care, but I want to make sure that our veterans get what they think is best for them. People around Lufkin that go to that clinic, they say, hey, I would far rather go to this VA clinic than any other medical facility. Other places, I hear from veterans that go to other clinics that say, I'd just soon you give us a card and let us go to any doctor, any clinic we want. But at the same time, all of this is going on, and we were told there now is a need to increase the contribution from veterans for TRICARE. We find out there's $5.2 billion been sitting there unspent, unobligated for the last couple of years. Department of Justice, $1.9 billion. Hear that we have them coming in before our committee, whining and moaning about all the millions and millions of dollars they need. Turns out they've got $1,900 million that they could use instead of coming begging here for more money to Congress. You've got other independent agencies and miscellaneous, $82 billion unobligated, unspent. The Office of Personnel Management, $55 billion. I know that the administration spends more money than any other administration in history, far and away a lot more, but you would think that they wouldn't have to come demanding more and more money from and putting pressure on Harry Reid down in the Senate to get more and more out of the House because they just can't live on the $55 billion slush fund they have from the last couple of years unspent. International assistance programs, $45 billion. I've said it over and over, but it is absolutely true. I've seen it firsthand going around. You could even see it some areas of Afghanistan. You don't have to pay people to hate you. They'll do it for free. It would save a lot of money. I still have a UN voting accountability bill. I've filed it my 4th time in this 4th Congress I've been in. It says unless you vote with the United States over half the time in the UN, that you shouldn't get any foreign assistance from the United States. Again, these people in foreign countries that hate us, it is absolutely their right to do so. But we don't have to pay people to hate us. They'll do it for free. Environmental Protection Agency. One of those things that was created when Congress made the mistake of giving the Nixon administration the power to consolidate and reorganize government and make it more efficient. The Nixon administration created the Environmental Protection Agency. And right now, the EPA is in the process of costing thousands and thousands and thousands of people jobs all over America. And this administration is doing nothing to rein them in. Some people have said, well, can the Congress do something about that? Sure we can. We can get rid of the EPA. I've been told by some federal authorities, but you don't understand. Even though Texas has an environmental commission, the TCEQ, there are a handful of states that don't have environmental commissions for their states. So we need one for the whole country. What happened to the 9th and 10th Amendment? If it is just inside the state, doesn't involve interstate commerce, then why shouldn't we let the states take care of those issues? Instead, the EPA is spending some of their slush fund money to sue states like Texas and others, shutting down power plants. And I would have thought today that when the President released his statement about why he was going to deprive tens of thousands of Americans jobs immediately where they could earn their own way and own their own things without the government handouts, that he would at least be able to say, because I have a better plan of getting us off foreign oil. Not what he said. Apparently, it's the President's position He wants to get us off oil, not off foreign oil, just off oil. He wants to put more people out of work, increase the cost of gasoline and diesel, which means increasing the cost of everything you buy in America because transportation costs have to be figured in. The one good thing about the President killing the Keystone Pipeline that you have to acknowledge, with money like the EPA has, $4 billion, and transportation, $45 billion sitting there in their slush fund, unobligated, unspent from the last 2 years, different other agencies, departments, Department of Interior. By canceling the Keystone Pipeline, they won't have to spend money checking it out, regulating, making sure things are done appropriately, so they can spend these hundreds of billions of dollars, if they care to do so, on more Solyndras. Isn't that a great thing? We'll be able to fund more crony capitalism. If somebody wants to come in and claim they're going to create some kind of solar product, then this administration will take a good look at it. And there's a good chance if you're a Republican you can forget it, but if you're not, you may very well be the next Solyndra to get money appropriated for you. And heck, we may even have one of the administration step in when creditors, the United States as a creditor, wants to stand in line and get repaid for loans that are made, and downgrade those loans and put other unsecured creditors in front, just as the administration did in the bailout of the auto manufacturers. Turn the Constitution upside down, deprive people of property without due process. There's a lot of money to do those good projects that the President has been doing for the last 3 years. So, Mr. Speaker, I hope that in the days ahead, as people hear more and more complaining and whining from the administration about there not being any money, gee, we're going to have to raise taxes, I hope that there will be people in America that will look at these figures and say, enough whining. Let us tell you about a shortage of money. You keep taking our money in taxes and sitting on it in your departments. Enough is enough. It's time to be accountable. It's time to let money be in the hands where it is earned, so we can get this economy going again. Because one thing's for sure, even though we've spent more money than any nation in history, no matter how you want to look at it, whether it's in dollars or whether it's in percentage of GDP, this administration has been on a course for ruin. And I just hope that as this administration continues to follow the lead of countries like Greece, Italy, Spain, others in economic trouble, that hopefully before we go over the cliff with them, there'll be enough of us that can stop the wagon train and get us back on the right road to prosperity. Quick recap, $687 billion that have been appropriated or unobligated, unspent from 2010 and 2011, so we shouldn't hear any more belly aching about there being a shortage of money by this administration. It's time to help the American people, not the bloated government. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5, 2011, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall, for a period of 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the time. I appreciate you giving me a moment to set up my charts because I've got some pretty ones down here, and I'm sorry you can't see them, Mr. Speaker. I've got here the White House. You know, the White House isn't the President's house, it's our house. And I think that every time I drive by, Mr. Speaker, I go past and I think, you know what? I own that. I may live in a little old apartment of my own, but when I drive by the White House, I think I own a piece of that. That house belongs to me. And I hope every American believes that same thing. It is our house, and if you have not gone to your member of Congress to try to get a tour of the White House, I encourage you to do it. I encourage you to do it because it belongs to you, and presidents, Republican and Democrat alike, open up those doors so that we can see our White House as American. It's a symbol of freedom around the world. I printed this one up in full color. I spent a little extra. I'm pretty thrifty in my budget. If you know anything about me, you know not only did we cut our budget here in the U.S. House of Representatives, I cut mine another 10%. Beyond that, we're going to give back about $300,000 to the American taxpayer. But we spent the extra money to put down the blue sky of optimism, because this is the President's election night victory speech in 2008. Do you remember it? Do you remember it, Mr. Speaker? Because I remember it. I remember the promise of a better day, and here it is, as he's talking about bipartisanship, because it gets a lot of lip service in this body, Mr. Speaker, but it takes hard work. It takes hard work. Here we go. Talking about bipartisanship and partisanship in particular, he says, I will resist the temptation to fall back on the same partisanship and pettiness and immaturity that has poisoned our politics for far too long. Hadn't been sworn in yet. Inauguration hasn't happened yet. Victory speech, 2008. I will resist the temptation to fall back on the same partisanship and pettiness and immaturity that has poisoned our politics for far too long. That inspires me, Mr. Speaker. Would that it be true. Let's move past full color to the stark black and white that is the world we're living in today, Mr. Speaker. Here is the President from last month giving up on that commitment of bipartisanship. When questioned about the partisan angle that he took throughout the Social Security debate, throughout the Doc Fix debate, throughout the unemployment debate, he said this, that he concluded it was going to take more than a year. It was going to take more than 2 years. It was going to take more than one term, probably takes more than one president. Mr. Speaker, you know as well as I know, we've only been in this institution just over 1 year now. It does not take time, it takes courage to make things happen in this body. It does not take hours, it takes I-do's. It takes somebody standing up and saying, I will be responsible for that. Which the President did, Mr. Speaker. He said, I will be responsible for ushering in a new era into Washington, D.C. As a freshman legislator, I took him at his word. 4 years later, here we are. Can't do it in a year, can't do it in 2 years, he couldn't do it in 3 years, and now he says it probably takes more than one president. Might take a different president. But he says it's going to take more than one. Let me take you back to sunshine and apple pie, Mr. Speaker, because that's what we're about here in America. We thrive on challenges. We thrive on opportunities to do better. We want one generation to do better than the previous generation. We want the next generation to do better than our generation. Here's what President Obama says. August 2008, talking about his vice presidential pick. After decades of steady work across the aisle, I know he'll, talking about Senator Biden, now Vice President Biden, be able to help me turn the page on the ugly partisanship in Washington so we can bring Democrats and Republicans together to pass an agenda that works for the American people. Who doesn't believe in that, Mr. Speaker? Who doesn't believe in that? Who doesn't believe it's not necessarily compromise? It can be consensus. Who doesn't believe on coming together to pass an agenda that works for the American people? You do, Mr. Speaker. I do. Take you back to the stark black and white, Mr. Speaker, of where we've come. President Obama, November 2010. just 2 months ago, when talking about why it is his administration has taken on such a partisan tone. He says this: I neglected some things that matter a lot to people, and rightly so that it matters to people. Maintaining a bipartisan tone in Washington. I'm going to redouble my efforts to go back to some of those first principles. Mr. Speaker, you and I came here for the same reason. We came here to get stuff done for our constituents back home. We came here to uphold the Constitution and the freedoms that it preserves for our constituents back home. We've been stuck in a environment in Washington, D.C. where the Senate refuses to act on any of the legislation that we put forward, refuses to act on any of their own legislation. We have a president who says this about his leadership in this town: I neglected some of the things that matter to a lot of people, and rightly so that they matter. Maintaining a bipartisan tone in Washington. And I'm going to redouble my efforts to go back to some of those first principles. Well, you know, Mr. Speaker, that's the funny thing about principles. You're not supposed to have to go back to them. You're supposed to stick with them. Day in, day out, good times, bad times. It's easy to have principles in the good times. Whew, it's easy. It's when times get tough that principles really matter. This was 2 months ago, Mr. Speaker. The President is going to redouble his efforts to go back to some of those first principles of his, which is ending the partisan tone in Washington, D.C. November 2010. Well, folks know what happened. Probably this a year ago. Folks know what happened in November 2011. We began the discussion of what to do to solve health care issues for our seniors, because Medicare reimbursement rates were on their way down and seniors might not have had access to care. We wanted to protect our seniors to make sure that access to care existed. We had unemployment benefits that were getting ready to expire. We had folks who were depending on those benefits, trying to sort out how it was that we'd continue those and reform that program so it doesn't just provide a check, but it provides a way back to employment. And we had Social Security, the payroll tax break that the President instituted December of 2010, right after he made this comment, that reduces the Social Security contributions of every working American by a third. Reduces the Social Security contributions of every working American by a third, but does nothing to change the benefits that those working Americans get back when they retire, and thus accelerates the bankruptcy of the Social Security Trust Fund, not to mention breaking that link that has been omnipresent in this country with Social Security. It is not an entitlement in the welfare sense of the word. It is an entitlement in that you paid into it, and so you have earned it. You deserve it. We're changing that linkage for the very first time. And following that debate, I wake up in the morning down in the 7th District of Georgia, they're the northern suburbs there of Atlanta. I was in Gwinnett County. Wake up to find out the President has made recess appointments. Oh, I got to tell you, I went through the roof, but you might not have gone through the roof, Mr. Speaker. I don't know where everybody was, all 300 million Americans, where they were when they woke up to that news that morning, or where they were with regard to their Constitution. I carry mine. I know you carry yours, Mr. Speaker, and I would encourage anybody who doesn't have one to contact another member of Congress. We can absolutely get you one. The United States Constitution, the rule book by which everything we do here should be judged. Should be judged. That's why recess appointments matter, Mr. Speaker. What I have here, Mr. Speaker, is Article 2, Section 2 of the United States Constitution. It's Clause 3. I'll just back up just a little bit, make it clear for folks who haven't studied the Constitution recently. Article 1 delegates the legislative powers to the United States Congress. Article 1, the very first order of business of our Founding Fathers in framing our republic, was to protect the people's powers here in the people's house and in the United States Senate. Article 1. Article 2 vests power in the executive. Article 2, Section 2, Clause 3. The President shall have the power to fill up all vacancies that may happen during the recess of the Senate by granting commissions which shall expire at the end of their next session. Seems pretty straightforward. Pretty straightforward, but it's not. You know, that's what's so wonderful about our Constitution, Mr. Speaker. Our Founding Fathers had the wisdom to say enough without saying too much. Shortly after the ratification of the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton was writing on this topic. And when he read this very same clause, he read this: the President shall have the power to fill up all vacancies that may happen during the recess of the Senate. What Alexander Hamilton saw, Mr. Speaker, is that the only vacancies that can be filled are those vacancies that occur during a recess of the Senate. Not vacancies that are getting filled then, but vacancies that actually occurred then. This is important language. It's important language because I live 640 miles away from the United States Capitol. Now, I happen to travel with my friends at Delta, and they get me here in an hour and a half. But if I had to get on my horse and ride, it'd take a little while. There's a good reason there was recess appointments going on in the founding of this republic, Mr. Speaker, and I hope we can get back to having more recess here. Why in the world we've let this Congress evolve into a full-time job that takes place year-round, I do not know. General Assembly in Georgia meets for 40 days. 40 days out of a year. I tell folks back home, I will have achieved success when it is we in Washington, D.C. who only meet for 40 days out of a year, because we have sent that power that has been gradually stolen from the people, stolen from the communities, stolen from the states, and returned that power to those communities. But it was a real issue in the early days of our republic that there was a recess, and we wanted to give the President the power to continue the republic even when you couldn't get a hold of the United States Senate for confirmation. Well, in the age of iPads and BlackBerries and fax machines, it's not that hard to get in touch with folks. Not that hard to get in touch, folks. Easy to reconvene the Senate, but still on the books today, President shall have the power to fill all vacancies that may happen during the recess of the Senate. Now, you may be asking, Rob, why do you even care about this? You're in the House. This doesn't concern you. Let me tell you, this concerns me, and it concerns every American, because it concerns the rule book by which our republic is governed. And if we decide that the rule book doesn't matter, something small today, it's going to be something medium-sized tomorrow. It's going to be something huge a year from now. And the freedoms that our Constitution has so ably protected for over 200 years will soon be gone. Now, this isn't a partisan fight. This is an American fight. I'll tell you that when we had a Republican president in the White House and Republican members controlling this U.S. House and Republican members controlling the U.S. Senate, power left this House and went down to the executive branch. Republicans allowed legislative power to leave this House and get transferred to the executive branch. We've got to be on duty all the time. It's not Republican-Democrat. It's executive U.S. House. Why? Because when our framers were framing the Constitution, they knew tyranny of the executive was what was to be feared. King of England. Tyranny of the executive was what was to be feared, and so they invested most of the power in the people's house, in the Congress, in the House, in the Senate. This is where our framers trusted that power to reside. But they gave to the President the power to make appointments in recess of the Senate. Why is this important at all? Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2, which is known as the Advice and Consent Clause. The President shall have the power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided that two-thirds of senators present concur, and he shall nominate, and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers, and counsels, and judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States whose appointments are not herein otherwise provided for. Hear this. The President absolutely, positively has the power to appoint whomever he wants by and with the advice and consent of the United States Senate. By and with the consent of the United States Senate. If the Senate is not in session, Clause 3 takes over. During those times, the President shall have the power to fill those vacancies, and it shall not extend past that one session. Well, Mr. Speaker, what happened over Christmas? What happened over Christmas? As the rights and privileges of the American people were stolen out from under us here in the United States House and Senate and transferred to the executive branch, is that the President said, and you'll remember the quote, he said, if I can't do it with Congress, I'll go around Congress. Do you remember that, Mr. Speaker? If I can't pass my agenda with Congress, I will go around Congress. Tyranny of the executive. The most fundamental fear our framers had, Mr. Speaker. Most fundamental fear was that an executive would decide that he or she could do whatever they wanted without the consent of the governed. We have to stand up as Republicans and Democrats and say there is a right way and a wrong way to run this town, that there is a rule book by which this town is governed, that there is 200 years of precedent that tells us how appointments must occur, how that advice must occur, when those appointments can be made. Well, if you followed any of this, and we'll talk about this more in the weeks to come because it goes to the bedrock of our republic. Again, if you let your reverence for the Constitution slide when it's convenient for you, you're going to find it pulled out from under you when you need it most. And, Mr. Speaker, I know that when you swore your oath to the people of this country, you swore your oath not to protect the Constitution from Democratic presidents, not to protect the Constitution from Republican presidents, but to protect the Constitution from all enemies, foreign and domestic. Your oath, whether there's a Republican in the White House or a Democrat in the White House, is to make sure that the people's power remains here with the people. We legislate, and the President executes. This isn't a mystery, Mr. Speaker. This isn't something that I just came up with in the 7th District of Georgia. This is something that President Bush and Senator Harry Reid struggled with during the Bush administration. This is something all Congresses and presidents struggle with. The struggle is not new. The complete abdication of constitutional responsibility, that's new. The deciding that if you can't do it with the Constitution, you'll go around the Constitution, that's new. Let me tell you what Harry Reid said, Mr. Speaker. I hold in my hand here a copy of that page from the congressional record. As you can see, we record absolutely every word that goes on here. We don't want folks to be misquoted. We don't want the debate to go on and folks not to be able to remember what was said. We want to hold folks accountable to the people back home. Tell you what Harry Reid said as it was recorded right here by the reporters, published in the congressional record. He says, Mr. President, November 16th, 2007. Mr. President, the Senate will be coming in for pro forma sessions during the Thanksgiving holiday to prevent recess appointments. Now, I understand